If you thought last week's movie was strange, this one is going to take things to another level. Wax, or The Discovery of Television Among the Bees, is an experimental film, a video project, a one-man show. Although, if you watch the credits, you'll find them to have more than one person listed. You'll find them to be surprisingly long. The film supposedly features William S. Burroughs, but really it just uses a clip of him, which I'm not convinced was filmed for this movie. The credits also list Father Bessarion, a priest, who appears briefly. At first, I thought, wow, there's a priest in this movie. That's going to be great, a real priest starring in a movie, but it's really just sort of a random clip of him talking to David Blair. David Blair is at the center of the movie. This is his child. He stars in the film, narrates it. For better or worse, this is his creation. If you look closely through the credits, though, you will find one interesting name, which is Lev Manovich, who apparently worked on the animations. Manovich is a fairly famous theorist. I've never been a fan of his work. This movie is on YouTube, although it is bracketed by the trailer for the sequel, which I would skip if I were you. Depending on how much interest you have in offbeat films, you might really think that this movie is fun, or if that's not really your cup of tea, you're probably not going to enjoy it much. This is a dynamic movie, an off-the-wall movie, an interesting movie, a fun movie in some ways, but it certainly has some drawbacks. For me, it was somewhere in between unwatchable and kind of groovy. In addition to being on YouTube, this movie supposedly has the distinction of being the first film to be streamed on the internet. In some ways, this is a gimmick that I hesitated to even tell you about, but in other ways, it is apropos of some of the ideas in the movie. Well, sort of. Like I said, this is mostly a one-man show, so at the very least, there is this question of how do you make a movie by yourself? This movie is from 1991, when good cameras weren't so easy to find. Overall, the production quality here is pretty low. It kind of seems like an amateur film, but that doesn't mean that it's bad. David Blair makes a few shrewd choices to simplify things. For instance, there was almost no sound recorded on location. Instead, the movie is driven by voiceover, which guides us through footage of Blair running around in his beekeeping outfit, which looks suspiciously like a spacesuit in some ways. You know, this is a technical simplification, not having to record sound, but it also means that the movie in some ways doesn't really feature much acting. It sort of has pantomime of various scenes, but we never really hear anybody talk. There's one random interview inserted in the movie for some reason, but the voiceover sidesteps acting, which was probably a good choice. The live action stuff is spliced together with stock footage and a bunch of early digital animations. The film makes use of some interesting 3D effects as well, sort of 3D transitions. There's a bunch of warped shots, for instance, shots that are sort of curled like this, right, violating the proscenium effect of the traditional cinematic staging, where the image covers the whole screen and is, flat on your screen and such. There are a bunch of shots where the footage here is like rolled up into a cylinder or bent over on itself. Maybe this cylindrical thing or these warps are vaguely reminiscent of a bug's point of view, a bee's point of view to be specific. I'm not sure. I kind of suspect that some of these transitions and effects were built into whatever hulking editing machine was used to piece the film together. They kind of remind me of like 1990s television like transitions. And I know for a fact, having seen some of these early like live broadcasting rigs, that they had a lot of these sort of motion graphics built in. Look, if they developed this all for the movie, then hey, that's pretty cool. But I suspect that that might not be the case. In some ways, this movie reminds me of an early YouTube video where someone has stuck iMovie transitions in between every clip. It's like the slideshow that the kid makes where there's a star wipe between every single image. That said, one of the things that is cool about this movie is how dynamic and off the wall the style is, so I won't complain about it too much. It is kind of fun to watch and just to see all the quirky things they get up to. Some of the animations, not so much the transitions, but some of the animations I think are kind of cool. Not exactly cutting edge, especially not today, but for a small production, they seem fairly impressive. This movie is, in some ways, undeniably ambitious. The film opens up with a sort of prologue, a background. It introduces the forefathers of some characters we'll meet later on. Here, there isn't really any live action footage, and the movie kind of looks like a Chris Marker film, edited together from a bunch of different stills. It kind of sounds like a Ken Burns documentary in some ways. The first section is kind of an alternate history of early film, focusing partly on the so-called Supernormal Pictures Society. This film is sort of conspiratorial, and here the theory is that one of the first purposes of cameras, of these camera mechanisms was to capture traces of dead souls which linger just out of sight. The dead are going to be a significant theme throughout the film, although exactly what the narrative is here, or what the thesis is, what the point is a little hard to know. I did kind of enjoy this opening section. This early history is kind of fun, and it's interesting the way it mirrors some ideas in film theory about the image, the capturing of the image, and death, and such, time, right? Before too long, the movie jumps forward into the present day, and we meet the character that is played by David Blair. His name is Jacob Maker, and he's the grandson of one of the characters from the first part. This part of the movie is set in Alamogordo, New Mexico, and is backgrounded by the space program and by military aviation. Jacob Maker works for a company that develops simulations that are used to train fighter pilots. In his spare time, he is, of course, you guessed it, a beekeeper. One day, he's tending to his bees when he has some kind of vision. He gets sucked into some sort of transcendental experience by the beehive. This happens a few times, and before long, the bees have inserted some kind of crystalline television into his brain. This TV supplies him with further transcendental visions and stirs up some sort of connection with the dead, including perhaps the dead affected by these military appliances that he works on. At first, there's a somewhat clear delineation between Jacob's visions and the real world. There's sort of this logic of here's the real thing and here's the supernatural thing. But this goes out the window pretty quickly, and the film sort of continuously slips from one context to another. Again, the voiceover narration sort of pins the movie down, only sort of. The movie, the voiceover does, I think, push the story along nicely. There's ways in which it really sets up something, or it's hard to imagine the movie without it, let me put it that way. But the film also kind of overdoes things a little bit. In most movies, narration, of course, is just a bridge between different things, and having an entire film be narrated is different. In some ways, it might make it feel a little bit tedious. I don't know. The tone of the narration is also somewhat puzzling. It is delivered in a deadpan way, despite being kind of whimsical. David Blair's voice is kind of that of a documentarian, but it's also a bit goofy sounding. The writing itself is up and down as well. The film has poetic moments, like at one point he says, "I wanted to take a picture, but all I could do was dance." Sort of poetic, but in this kind of dry and arrhythmic way or something. The narration, much like most of the movie, is a bit confounding. Of course, if you removed it, the movie would be unintelligible. So we're dealing here with not just an alternate genre, but kind of an alternate form. And I don't know, you might wonder, is this really a movie at all in the traditional sense, right? Another question, I guess, is whether or not this film's quirks and idiosyncrasies are born out of necessity, right? If this is just the compromises he's had to make, or the shrewd choices that he's made because it's such a small production, or if there are times and places where this form is really the best way to get some message across, right? That would be a big endorsement of the film if we said, no, look, this is how to tell this story. This is the best way to express these ideas. Unfortunately, I think that's probably not the case. I think it probably is more of a story of limitations. There are a few parts, though, that I like that I'll highlight in a second. You can probably already tell that this is a fairly convoluted movie. You would, I think, lose your mind if you tried to recount the entire plot, but there are some fairly conspicuous themes, so I can tell you something about what this film is about. I mentioned the military technology already. This movie seems somewhat tied up in the Gulf War. We hear all about these Mesopotamian bees, and the film climaxes with Jacob piloting a fighter jet in the Middle East. Not exactly the ending you would expect for a film that has a vaguely anti-war idea in it, maybe, at some point. Anyway, he takes out a tank. Maybe not exactly what you expect. I guess that's a spoiler, but this isn't exactly the kind of movie you can spoil. Honestly, I didn't find the sort of conflict angle, the sort of war angle, to be too interesting. Unease around the militarization of modernity is a pretty common theme. There are some moments, though, where I think they have something to say. For instance, at one point, Jacob picks up a payphone. The narrator says, "I dialed 0 for the operator, but I got ground 0 instead." And then we cut to a bunch of stock footage of bombs dropping, explosions, havoc. This idea that ground 0 is a place you can call on the phone, I kind of like that. That's kind of clever. Ground 0, of course, it's not a real place. It's a military concept. It's sort of grim that we even have that phrase. I think it was propagated by the U.S. military during World War II. I don't think people said ground 0 before World War II. Part of this movie is set at the Trinity test site, by the way, where apparently there is a beehive. The idea that Ground Zero not only would exist, but would be accessible by phone, that you could call it, is even more jarring. In one way, it's destroyed by technology. In another way, it's created by it. It might be worth noting that this movie diverges a little bit from your typical postmodern kind of thing. What I've described so far might seem to check all the boxes. We've got simulations, right? He works at this company where they make these Minecraft-esque fighter jet training programs. We've got distrust of technology. But the movie kind of undermines this with its central metaphor of television. In just about every postmodern film, television is the focal point of cultural deterioration. Or at least it's the intersection between culture and technology. It's the TikTok of yesteryear, what can I say? In this movie, though, television seems to be some kind of oracle, some transcendental thing presented to Jacob by the bees. So the television is kind of a good thing. Maybe there's some irony here. It's a little bit puzzling, right? It's a little bit puzzling. What is the role of the television in this movie? This film kind of rewrites the history of early cinema and also possibly of TV. It seems as though neither of them exist in their real form inside of the movie. It's a little hard to know what to make of this. Okay, another big theme of this movie is disassociation. As the film goes on, Jacob Maker kind of loses track of himself. He floats back into the lives of his ancestors. There is this transcendental experience. Now, the whole film is still narrated in the first person with just one voice. So I guess all these characters, they happen to sound exactly the same. Actually, I think it's maybe this dissonance that makes the disassociation possible. If you had 3 different voices for 3 different characters, we would not be talking about disassociation. We'd just be talking about having 3 different characters. But having one voice, having one thread that becomes sort of unmoored from an individual character is an interesting mechanic. On the flip side, there's also some interesting moments of personification, kind of unexpected one. For instance, many of the missiles and the bombs in the film are described as people. For instance, there is Fat Boy, the first and loneliest plutonium bomb. This is a fairly consistent motif in the film, and I don't really know what to make of it. Again, I will say that you might have a tendency to try to read this as an anti-war movie to some degree. And certainly there is something here about unease of technology, but there's also a few moments that kind of wind back the other way, like personification of the bombs. Talking about Fat Boy as being lonely is odd. The scope of this movie is extremely wide. It has ideas about death and war, but it also has a biological angle, an astronomical angle. Apparently, there is another planet inside of the Earth where the dead people live, or maybe the dead people live on the moon. I was a little unclear about that. There's also a spiritual element to it and a religious element to it. They talk about the Tower of Babel, the story of Cain and Abel. There is historical stuff, geometric stuff. I probably would have preferred a more specific and rigorous development of just a few of these ideas, rather than this extremely sprawling scope in which nothing is quite pinned down. The last thing I want to talk about is my reaction to this sort of film more generally. I said already that this isn't quite a one-man production, and I hesitate to call it an amateur film, but maybe we can say it's experimental. There are other movies like this. I'm reminded a little bit of the works of one Neil Breen, although I think this film is higher quality than most of his work. One thing that I think is telling about these sort of movies is that they almost always end up implicating or even incriminating their creators. Editing is often the hallmark of high-quality work, which says a lot about this channel, I know. But amateur films often don't have enough stuff removed. And sometimes they end up telling on their creators somewhat. Sometimes they're just one long Freudian slip. Now, I don't think this movie reveals too many of David Blair's deep, dark secrets and fantasies, unless he really likes bees, I don't know. But he's clearly at the center of the movie in an interesting way. When watching the movie, you will wonder, almost certainly, you're going to wonder what he made of it, what he was thinking, how he thinks of his own work, right? It's really common for fans of cult films, to ask something like, oh, did they know this was bad? Or how did they not realize? For this movie, I don't think those questions are quite fair because I don't even reach for the B word in describing this movie, bad. But David Blair is at the center of it, and it's conspicuous. You do think of him while watching it. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's a failure, but it's an interesting dynamic. Overall, I would not recommend this movie unless you are into this kind of movie, in which case go for it. Look, if you like experimental films, this is pretty dynamic. I think there is some interesting stuff here. No doubt David Blair is a creative guy and an ambitious guy. Hey, look, this is great. Go out, make a cool movie. And this film really has had a life, you know? It's gotten out there. Random people have watched it. Pretty cool, right? That's pretty cool. Ultimately, the film is a bit toothless, and I think it winds up as more of an oddity than anything else. And look, frankly, if you want an interesting movie from the time, go watch a David Cronenberg movie from 10 years earlier, and I think you'll find something more incisive, more interesting, more extreme, kind of more in every way. But still, Wax, or the discovery of television among the bees, is pretty cool. Let's face it. And look, you can go check it out on YouTube. Honestly, just go watch 5 minutes of it. You'll get an idea what the whole movie is like. Just go check it out. Have a quick look. You don't have to watch the whole thing.